Imagine boarding a first-class flight feeling calm and confident, only to be publicly questioned and insulted because of how you look. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Simone Hayes, a powerful biotech CEO traveling with her 12-year-old daughter, Lila, at the gate. The gate agent's words cut through the airport like a spotlight. You don't look like someone who belongs here. But what if the person you tried to humiliate was someone who holds nearly 30% ownership of the airline itself? As the plane prepared for takeoff, Simone and Lila faced not only suspicion, but a calculated effort by the crew to push them out of their seats. What would you do if your dignity was challenged in front of dozens of strangers? How do you fight invisible walls built on prejudice, all while protecting your child's innocence? This story is more than just about discrimination. It's about quiet strength, resilience, and standing your ground without raising your voice. It's about teaching the next generation to hold their heads high, even when the world tries to make them feel small. If you believe justice shouldn't wait, if you believe respect is a right for everyone, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's dive into Dr. Hayes' unforgettable journey. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of O'Hare International Airport, casting long shadows on the polished floor. The hum of travelers and rolling suitcases filled the air, a constant rhythm of movement and purpose. At gate C-15, the scene was no different. People stood waiting, chatting, glancing at their watches or phones as boarding was about to begin for Aurora Flight 2387 to Seattle. Dr. Simone Hayes moved calmly through the crowd, her footsteps deliberate yet unhurried. Beside her, her daughter Lila clutched a well-worn sketchbook, the edges bent and frayed from years of drawing. Lila's eyes darted around, wide and curious, but every so often she looked up at her mother for reassurance. Simone gave a subtle nod, a silent promise that everything was going to be fine. Simone wore a navy pantsuit tailored to perfection, paired with simple black flats. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, a silver bracelet, a keepsake from her late grandmother, resting lightly on her wrist. There was a quiet power in her presence, something that didn't demand attention, but commanded it anyway. As they approached the boarding counter, the gate agent looked up. Karen Whitman, a woman in her early 50s with a sharply pressed uniform and tightly pulled back hair, scanned their boarding passes. Her eyes lingered a little longer than necessary, narrowing slightly. Simone's pulse remained steady. She had faced doubts before. This would be no different. Karen tilted her head, clearing her throat. "First class?" she asked without much warmth. "Yes," Simone replied softly, her voice calm but firm. Karen's fingers tapped on the keyboard, a pause stretching longer than needed. Then she smiled thinly and said, "We've had a few incidents lately with passengers switching tickets, especially those traveling with children. Just making sure everything's in order." Simone held her gaze, a calmness hiding the irritation beneath. Her tickets were under her name. Everything was legitimate. Lila looked up from her sketchbook, her fingers still gripping the pencil. Why is she saying that? The innocence in her voice cut through the noise around them. Simone squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Sometimes people make assumptions before they know the truth," she whispered. Karen's voice rose slightly, loud enough to catch the attention of the small crowd gathering near the gate. "And you don't exactly look like someone who belongs in first class." The words landed like a slap. Lila froze, eyes wide. Simone's heart tightened, but her face remained serene. Behind them, a white couple exchanged uneasy glances. Some travelers turned their heads, curiosity mixing with discomfort. No one spoke. The moment hung heavy. Simone didn't respond. She simply accepted their boarding passes back. Nodding politely, "Thank you," she said evenly. They stepped onto the jet bridge in silence. The cabin of Aurora Flight 2301 gleamed with subtle luxury. Wide leather seats, soft ambient lighting, the faint scent of fresh linen filled the air. Simone and Lila found their seats, 2A and 2B. Simone took the aisle seat, Lila the window, her sketchbook resting on her lap. Across the aisle sat David Sinclair, a middle-aged white executive in a sharp suit. He gave them a quick, appraising look, adjusting his cufflinks with a slight frown. Nearby, Grace Lee, an elderly Korean-American woman, quietly read a book, her eyes calm and steady. Flight attendant Aaron Wallace approached with a professional smile, greeting them warmly but with a hint of reservation. "Welcome aboard. If you need anything, just let me know." Simone nodded, returning the smile. Lila glanced up briefly before returning to her sketchbook. Minutes passed quietly. Then Aaron returned, this time accompanied by Derek Schultz. Their demeanor was colder, less welcoming. "We'll need to verify your seat assignments once again," Aaron said, without preamble. Simone handed over the boarding passes, her fingers brushing lightly over the smooth paper. Derek's eyes scanned the documents, then the passengers. "There have been some recent mix-ups with people switching seats to get into premium cabins," he said, voice low but sharp. Simone's gaze didn't waver. "Our tickets are valid and booked months ago," Lila's small voice whispered. "Why are they making this so hard?" Simone closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people are scared of what they don't understand." Aaron's smile tightened, her eyes flicking away. Just then, a voice came from behind them. Marcus Fields, an off-duty black pilot seated nearby, spoke clearly and firmly. "She's been in that seat since boarding. Haven't moved. No issues." Grace Lee looked up from her book, her gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on the gate agents. There was a quiet solidarity in her eyes. Simone caught Lila's hand again. "We're here. That's all that matters." But even as she spoke the words, a storm was gathering in the cabin, a storm that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The hum of conversation inside the first-class cabin of Aurora Flight 2387 was a quiet murmur of polite exchanges and the occasional rustle of magazines. Simone settled into seat 2A with practiced ease while Lila slid into 2B. The window seat, clutching her sketchbook tightly as if it were a shield. The soft leather embraced them, the subtle lighting casting a warm glow on their faces. But the atmosphere felt charged beneath the calm. Across the aisle, David Sinclair's eyes lingered a little too long, his gaze sharp and calculating. He adjusted his AirPods with a slight smirk, clearly unsettled by their presence. Simone met his glance without flinching. She understood the weight behind that look, the silent judgment, the invisible barrier built on assumptions rather than facts. Nearby, Grace Lee continued her reading, eyes occasionally lifting from her book to scan the cabin. Her presence a quiet anchor amid the subtle tension. Flight attendant Aaron Wallace moved toward them with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She carried a clipboard but spoke with the softness of someone following orders she did not fully agree with. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Hayes. If you need anything during the flight, please do not hesitate to ask," she said carefully, her tone polite yet distant. Simone nodded and smiled in return, her voice steady. "Thank you." Lila glanced up from her sketchbook, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. The gentle rhythm of her drawing stopped as if she sensed the shift in the air. Minutes slipped by with no disturbances, but the stillness was only temporary. Aaron returned accompanied by Derek Schultz, whose sharp eyes and rigid posture seemed to slice through the calm. He carried himself like a man who believed firmly in rules and procedure. No room for exceptions. "We will need to verify your seat assignments once again," Aaron announced, handing Simone's boarding pass back and forth between them. Simone raised an eyebrow, but handed over the passes without hesitation. Her skin prickled with the familiar ache of being scrutinized under an unspoken lens. Derek's eyes scanned the boarding passes, then flicked to the two of them seated side by side. His voice lowered, but carried enough edge to cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "There have been several cases recently where passengers switch seats to gain access to premium cabins. It's important to ensure that only authorized passengers occupy these seats," he said, fixing Simone with a pointed look. Simone's voice did not waver as she replied, "Our tickets were booked months ago. Everything is in order." Lila's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the tension. "Why do they keep asking? We haven't done anything wrong." Simone swallowed the lump rising in her throat and looked down at her daughter. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand," she said gently, her eyes reflecting years of experience with the invisible barriers placed in front of her. Aaron's smile faltered, the tightness around her eyes betraying the discomfort she tried to hide. She looked away, leaving Simone with the heavy weight of silent judgment hanging over them. Suddenly, a voice rose from a few rows back, clear and confident. Marcus Fields, a black pilot off-duty and traveling as a passenger, stepped forward. "She's been in that seat since boarding and hasn't moved." "No issues," Marcus said plainly, his tone calm but firm. Heads turned. Grace Lee closed her book and leaned slightly forward. "They have done nothing wrong," she added softly. Derek scoffed under his breath, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Simone's heart tightened at the sight of her daughter shrinking into her seat. The sketchbook suddenly clutched tighter, as if it could shield her from the growing storm. She reached over and squeezed Lila's hand gently. "We're here, and we belong," she whispered. The cabin remained tense but quiet. No one dared speak out against the crew's authority, but many were watching closely now. The silent witnesses multiplied with every glance and every whispered word. Aaron cleared her throat and said, "Thank you for your patience. We are just making sure everything is in place before takeoff." Simone's mind raced. She thought about the countless times she had faced similar skepticism in boardrooms, meetings, and conferences, the subtle, unspoken messages that told her she was an outsider in spaces she rightfully belonged to, the weight of assumptions that threatened to diminish her achievements. She glanced at Lila, whose wide eyes mirrored a mixture of confusion and quiet resilience. The little girl was too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but she felt it deeply. It was a lesson Simone wished she didn't have to teach so early. As the boarding process continued around them, the atmosphere in first class felt less like a luxurious sanctuary and more like a carefully controlled stage where power plays were silently enacted. David Sinclair shifted in his seat, his eyes briefly meeting Simone's. There was a flicker of something unspoken recognition, perhaps, or the first glimmer of doubt. Grace Lee gave a subtle nod, her expression one of quiet support. She seemed to understand the weight Simone carried and the strength it took to bear it. Simone's breathing slowed as she centered herself. This was more than a flight. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle, the battle to be seen, heard, and respected in a world quick to judge based on surface impressions. Lila looked up and asked again in a soft voice, "Mom, Will they stop? Simone smiled, the corners of her lips lifting just slightly. Sometimes we have to stand still until they realize they're wrong, she said. The engines began to rumble softly as the flight prepared for departure. The overhead lights dimmed to signal boarding was complete. Yet the tension in the cabin remained, a low hum beneath the polished veneer of first class. Aaron and Derek moved away, their posture rigid but eyes occasionally flicking back toward Simone and Lila. The quiet murmur of conversation resumed, but now with a new edge passengers were watching more carefully, listening more intently. Simone settled back in her seat, her posture straight but relaxed. She placed a protective hand over Lila's resting fingers. Lila's pencil resumed its dance across the paper, lines becoming steadier, bolder. The flight was about to take off, but Simone knew the real journey had just begun. The first-class cabin of Aurora Flight 2387 buzzed with a quiet tension that was impossible to ignore. Simone sat upright in her seat, eyes steady ahead, as if the moment did not concern her. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was gathering. Her daughter Lila sat beside her, clutching her sketchbook close to her chest, fingers trembling just slightly. The earlier insult at the gate still echoed in her mind, like a ghost whispering doubt. Flight attendant Aaron Wallace returned, her movements measured, carrying herself with the practiced professionalism expected at 30,000 feet. She stopped just outside the galley, casting a glance toward Simone and Lila. "Ms. Hayes, would you please step aside with me for a moment?" Her voice was polite but firm. Simone's eyes flicked toward Lila. The girl looked up, confusion mingling with a flicker of fear. Simone gently squeezed her hand. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back." Aaron led Simone toward the galley, away from the curious eyes of the other passengers. Derek Schultz followed closely behind, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. In the cramped space near the galley, Aaron's tone grew less practiced, tinged with something harsher beneath the surface. "We just need to verify some information before takeoff. Ms. Hayes, there have been several instances of seat swapping lately, especially involving first class. It's our job to ensure all passengers are where they belong." Simone remained calm. "My tickets are valid. I've already presented them twice." Derek crossed his arms. "This isn't personal, just procedure." Simone met his gaze evenly. "Then I expect it to be applied fairly and without prejudice." The words hung between them, sharp and clear. A faint murmur drifted from the cabin, the sound of other passengers whispering, unsure of what was unfolding beyond the curtain of the galley. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "She's been in that seat since boarding. Hasn't moved an inch." It was Marcus Fields, the off-duty pilot who had earlier spoken up. He stepped into the galley area, calm and steady. Aaron looked momentarily unsettled, but maintained her composure. "Mr. Fields, this is a matter for cabin crew." Marcus's voice was steady. "This isn't just about seats, it's about respect." Simone felt a flicker of gratitude toward the pilot. His presence was a reminder that not everyone aboard was content to stand silent. Aaron glanced away, then back to Simone. "If you would please cooperate, we can resolve this quickly." Simone's internal voice urged restraint. She was well aware that any sign of anger would only be twisted against her. Instead, she chose a different kind of power, quiet, unwavering. "I will cooperate when I see a legitimate reason. Until then, I will remain in my seat." Derek's jaw tightened. Aaron exchanged a look with him, tension mounting. Simone thought of Lila waiting alone in the cabin, her daughter's small hands, her bright eyes. The unfairness of having to defend not just herself, but her child, was a bitter weight. "Ms. Hayes," Aaron said more softly now, "we don't want to make this difficult. No one is making this difficult, but the assumptions you bring," Simone replied quietly. The conversation was interrupted by the soft click of a camera shutter. Simone turned to see Maya Bennett, the junior flight attendant, standing a few feet away. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes held something like regret. Maya stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Ramirez would like to speak with you privately when you are ready." Simone nodded, her mind racing through every possible scenario. The captain was a man she had yet to meet, but in this moment, he represented a potential ally or another obstacle. She straightened her jacket, took a deep breath, and returned to her seat. As she sat down, Lila reached for her hand. "Mom, why do they keep doing this?" Simone smiled softly, fighting back a surge of frustration. "Because sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand. But we will get through this together." Back across the aisle, David Sinclair avoided eye contact, his posture stiff. Grace Lee returned to her book, but kept glancing toward Simone and Lila. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the final call to prepare for takeoff. The tension had not eased, but instead settled into a low, simmering current. Simone closed her eyes briefly. In that moment, she made a silent vow to hold her ground, not just for herself, but for Lila, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The galley door opened once more, and Aaron returned alone. Her voice clipped and rehearsed. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for your patience. We are just completing the final checks." Simone nodded, but said nothing. As Aaron moved away, Derek's eyes met Simone's for a fleeting moment, not with anger this time, but with something like resignation. Simone's thoughts drifted to the larger forces at play, the silent systems that dictated who was seen and who was overlooked, who was given respect and who was denied it. She knew this flight was more than a journey from Chicago to Seattle. It was a battleground of dignity and quiet strength. And she was not about to lose. The soft hum of the aircraft's engines blended with the faint murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. Simone Hayes remained calm in 2A, a quiet pillar amid the growing unease. Her mind was focused, every detail in the cabin sharp and clear, from the subtle tension in the flight attendant's movements to the watchful eyes of her fellow passengers. This was no longer just a flight. It was a test of patience, dignity, and truth. As the cabin lights dimmed to signal the final boarding call, Simone reached into her leather laptop case, pulling out her phone with deliberate care. The device felt cool in her hand, a tool that carried more than just information. It held power and proof. She tapped a few times, bringing up the Aurora Air executive portal. The screen displayed her full profile. Dr. Simone Hayes, Chief Bioethics Officer, 28.6% shareholder in Aurora Air Holdings. Her name was bold and clear, verified with an official blue checkmark. The image next to it was a professional portrait that captured her calm strength. She turned the screen to face the nearby gate supervisor, who had followed her into the cabin with a clipboard. The man's eyes widened slightly, the rigidity in his posture softening as he absorbed the information. Simone's voice was steady but unmistakable. "This is who I am. I am not just a passenger. I am a decision-maker in this airline." The supervisor blinked, momentarily speechless. Karen Whitman, the gate agent, shifted uncomfortably behind him, her confident mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. A few passengers nearby began to lean in, curiosity turning into silent acknowledgement. David Sinclair looked away, his earlier smirk replaced by an awkward stillness. Grace Lee folded her book with care, nodding subtly. Simone felt Lila's fingers tighten around her hand. The girl looked up at her, wide-eyed and uncertain. Simone smiled gently and whispered, "We belong here." The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a case of suspicion or misplaced doubt. The power dynamics in the cabin realigned as the truth settled like a stone on the floor. Aaron Wallace approached once more, her steps hesitant. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for your patience. We will make sure everything is in order from here." Simone nodded without a word. The weight of every gaze was on her, but she carried it without complaint. From across the aisle, Marcus Fields gave a small nod of approval. Maya Bennett watched from a distance, her expression a mix of relief and respect. The cabin was quiet now, but the silence was thick with meaning. Simone's mind flashed to the countless times she had faced barriers like this, not just in airports, but boardrooms, conferences, and meetings. The subtle doubts cast on her competence, the whispered assumptions about her place in spaces dominated by others. Yet here she was, still standing, still unshaken. Her phone buzzed quietly, a reminder of the world beyond the plane. But she was focused on the moment, on the lesson she was teaching her daughter, not with words, but with presence. Lila reached into her sketchbook and began drawing again. Her strokes were firmer now, less hesitant. The girl was learning, absorbing the strength her mother exuded. Suddenly, the voice of Captain Mateo Ruiz came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're ready for departure and expect a smooth flight to Seattle. Thank you for flying Aurora Air." Simone glanced up, catching the captain's eye as he gave a subtle nod in her direction. Later, as the engines roared to life, Simone reflected on the battle fought. In these few minutes, the small victories won without raising her voice. This was only the beginning. The soft glow of the cabin lights bathed the interior in a calm, muted tone as passengers settled into their seats, preparing for takeoff. Simone Hayes remained composed in two-way, her gaze steady but thoughtful. She sensed the weight of the moment, the fragile balance between dignity and confrontation, between silence and the need to be heard. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tap on her shoulder. Maya Bennett, the junior flight attendant, leaned in with a quiet urgency. "Dr. Hayes, the captain would like to speak with you privately, if you're available." Simone nodded and followed Maya toward the front of the aircraft. The aisles felt narrower here, the space between crew and cockpit thick with unspoken tension. Captain Mateo Ruiz stood just outside the cockpit door. He was a man in his 50s, with streaks of gray in his hair and a calm but weathered demeanor. His eyes met Simone's with a respectful intensity. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice low and sincere, "I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced here today. This is not how we treat our passengers, especially not in first class, not on my aircraft." Simone inclined her head slightly, appreciating the directness but aware that words alone were not enough. "I've spoken with ground operations," the captain continued. "The individuals involved, including the gate agent, will be grounded and investigated upon landing. This is being taken seriously." Simone's mind raced as she processed the information. Justice felt near but still distant. "Thank you, Captain," she said softly. "I hope this isn't just a momentary response, but the start of lasting change." Captain Ruiz nodded. "I understand your concerns. If I may ask if you hadn't shown me proof of your role and status within Aurora Air, Would this conversation be happening? The question hung in the air between them. Simone's eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of something raw beneath her calm exterior. "I want to believe so," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "But I've learned that truth often needs a title to be heard." The captain exhaled slowly. "That is a painful reality. But I want you to know I'm committed to doing better. We will make sure you and your daughter are respected for the rest of this flight." Simone allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Captain. That means a great deal." As she turned to return to her seat, Maya Bennett stepped forward again. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Simone nodded. The gesture was small but meaningful. An olive branch extended amid the storm. Back in her seat, Lila looked up with curious eyes. "Mom, is it over?" Simone reached out and brushed a loose curl from her daughter's forehead. "For now," she said. "But the real work is just beginning." The engines rumbled louder as the plane prepared to taxi. Outside the window, the runway stretched ahead, a path toward new beginnings, as the seatbelt sign illuminated, signaling imminent takeoff. Simone reflected on the delicate balance of power and humility. The fight for dignity was not always loud or explosive. Sometimes it was quiet resolve, the steady heartbeat beneath the chaos. In the cabin around her, the air felt charged but more respectful. Flight attendants moved with care. Passengers exchanged glances filled with a new understanding. David Sinclair shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, his earlier confidence replaced by introspection. Grace Lee gave a small nod in Simone's direction, her eyes conveying support without words. Simone held Lila's hand firmly, grounding herself in the strength of their bond. The plane began its slow roll down the runway, engines roaring as it lifted gracefully into the sky. Above the clouds, Simone closed her eyes briefly. This flight was more than a journey from Chicago to Seattle. It was a testament to resilience, grace, and the power of quiet courage, and she was determined to see it through. The cabin lights were dimmed to a gentle glow as the flight cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. Simone Hayes sat quietly in her seat, her posture relaxed but alert. Beside her, Lila's pencil danced across the pages of her sketchbook, the lines sharper, more confident than before. The soft hum of the engines was a steady backdrop to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere within the first-class cabin. The flight attendants moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, their smiles polite but strained. Aaron Wallace's eyes flicked toward Simone and Lila more than once, her earlier reserve replaced by a palpable tension. Derek Schultz appeared less rigid, though his jaw clenched tightly whenever their eyes met. As the beverage cart approached, Aaron paused at Simone's row. Her voice was clipped, lacking the warmth she had earlier feigned. "Would you like something to drink, Ms. Hayes?" Simone returned a calm smile. "Sparkling water, please, and my daughter will have ginger oil." Layla looked up from her sketchbook, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you." Aaron poured the drinks without making eye contact, then moved on quickly, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and unease. Moments later, Derek Schultz passed by with a tray of meals. He handed Simone's dish over with a nod, but said nothing. When he reached Lila's seat, he hesitated before speaking. "Vegetarian option for the young lady." Simone watched as his eyes briefly met hers, then flicked away. "We're out of vegetarian meals," he said flatly. Simone's brow furrowed. "You didn't ask her preference." "It's policy to serve status members first," Derek replied. "I assumed she wouldn't qualify." Lila's small voice interrupted. "I'm a gold member. I fly every month to visit my grandmother. Derek's face flushed slightly, a brief flicker of discomfort crossing his features. I'll check again. He returned a few minutes later, his hand shaking slightly as he handed over a covered dish. Simone accepted it silently, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, David Sinclair cleared his throat and leaned forward. I've flown Aurora Air every quarter for 8 years, he said, directing his words toward Derek. I've never seen a crew treat someone this way. Derek froze, then muttered something about following procedure before walking away. Simone's eyes met David's. It wasn't about procedure, she said quietly. It was about assumptions. David nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling between them. Thank you, he said softly. In the rear of the cabin. Maya Bennett watched the exchange with quiet intensity. She had observed the subtle fractures within the crew, the way the professionalism they projected was cracking under pressure. Simone's mind wandered to the countless times she had seen systems designed to exclude rather than include. The invisible barriers, the silent judgments, the cracks that revealed the true nature beneath the polished surfaces. Lila reached for her mother's hand. Why do people only get quiet after they've already done something wrong? Simone smiled faintly, touched by her daughter's insight. Because silence is easier than accountability. The flight continued, the tension in the cabin a constant undercurrent beneath the routine hum of engines and whispered conversations. Simone closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. The battle was far from over, but each small victory mattered. She had taught Lila to hold her ground with grace and strength. Now it was time to see that lesson carried forward. The cabin had settled into a steady rhythm as the flight cruised over the vast expanse between Chicago and Seattle. Outside the windows, the clouds stretched endlessly, a shifting canvas painted with strokes of light and shadow. Inside, the tension that had simmered since boarding remained a low hum beneath the surface, felt more than spoken. Simone Hayes leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady on the sketchbook lying open on Lila's lap. The lines were bold now, confident, reflecting a strength that belied the girl's 12 years. Yet beneath the quiet focus, Simone sensed the weight her daughter carried, the unspoken questions, the struggle to understand a world that could be so unfair. From a few rows behind, Marcus Fields, the off-duty pilot who had earlier spoken up on Simone's behalf, approached quietly. His footsteps were soft but purposeful. He slid the corner of his phone out of his pocket and handed it to Simone without a word. The screen displayed a video, footage captured from boarding to the galley confrontation. The camera was steady, showing the interactions without narration or commentary, just raw truth laid bare. Simone watched silently, the moments unfolding with painful clarity. The gate agent's dismissive tone, the flight attendant's repeated questioning, the subtle but unmistakable expressions of doubt and suspicion. The moments were all there, preserved for anyone willing to see. She turned the phone back to Marcus. Thank you. This is important. Marcus nodded. Truth doesn't need embellishment. Sometimes all you need is the record. Simone's mind raced. Part of her longed to share the footage immediately, to expose the injustice and demand accountability. But another part urged patience, strategy. Sometimes a slow burn made a deeper impact than a sudden blaze. There's a time and place for everything, she said quietly. Right now, this flight is still in motion. I want to make sure this moment changes more than just this cabin. Marcus respected her decision with a slight nod. When you're ready, let me know. Simone slipped the phone into her purse and looked across the aisle where Lila was drawing again. The girl's brow furrowed in concentration, her hands steady now. "You handled this with more grace than most people ever could," Marcus said softly, leaning in just enough to be heard, but not intrusive. Simone smiled faintly. Grace is often mistaken for weakness until it isn't. The phrase hung between them like a quiet declaration. The rest of the flight attendants moved with more caution now. Jennifer Ross, the junior attendant who had quietly offered support earlier, approached Simone with a tentative smile. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," Jennifer whispered. "I saw what was happening, but I froze." Simone reached out and touched Jennifer's hand lightly. "Next time, don't. We need allies who stand with us." Jennifer nodded, relief washing over her face. As the hours passed, the flight crew's demeanor shifted noticeably. The earlier coldness thawed into a tentative professionalism. The subtle fractures among the crew deepened, some struggling with their own internal conflicts. Simone thought about the larger picture, the systems that created such divides, the unspoken rules that enforced exclusion under the guise of policy. She thought about Lila, growing up in a world that often judged too quickly, that rarely gave the benefit of the doubt, and she resolved to be a part of changing that world, starting here, in this cabin, on this flight. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Aurora Flight 2387 cruised steadily across the vast sky. The atmosphere inside first class was thick with an unspoken tension that had settled like a shadow over the polished seats and quiet conversations. Simone Hayes sat upright, her eyes scanning the cabin with quiet awareness. Beside her, Lila's fingers tapped lightly on her sketchbook, drawing shapes that reflected more than just imagination. They echoed the struggles of the day. Flight attendant Erin Wallace returned with a tray of drinks, her smile tight and rehearsed. "Ms. Hayes, would you care for something to drink?" Simone looked up and replied calmly, "Sparkling water, please, and my daughter will have ginger ale." Lila's soft thank you was barely audible, but Erin moved on without returning the courtesy. Behind the scenes, a deeper disruption was unfolding. Jennifer Ross approached Simone quietly, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Dr. Hayes, there's something you should know. The crew's been discussing you and your daughter before boarding. There's a private channel they use photos, comments, and not the kind you want to see." Simone's heart tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed cut deeper than she expected. "They shared your name the moment you checked in," Jennifer continued. "There were jokes, remarks, targeted comments. It wasn't just bias. It was planned." Simone's mind reeled. This wasn't an isolated incident or unconscious prejudice. It was a coordinated effort to make them feel unwelcome, to intimidate them before the flight even took off. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts. The silent war waged against her and her daughter was bigger than a single flight. It was a symptom of systemic discrimination baked into the very fabric of the institution. Back across the cabin, Marcus Field sat quietly, his phone resting on his lap. He hadn't posted the video footage he captured yet. He was waiting, calculating the right moment to bring the truth to light. Simone appreciated the patience. Timing, after all, was everything. The revelation ignited a new fire within her, a fierce determination to not only withstand, but to expose the rot that had allowed such behavior to thrive. She thought about Lila, who had already endured too much for her age. The girl's resilience was admirable, but no child should have to learn the painful lessons of exclusion so early. Simone reached for her daughter's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to get through this," she whispered. The rest of the crew moved with unusual restraint. Erin and Derek avoided eye contact. their earlier arrogance replaced by a guarded silence. Meanwhile, Jennifer Ross seemed to grow bolder, offering small gestures of kindness and professionalism that hadn't been there before. The flight attendants, who had once been the architects of exclusion, were now prisoners of their own shame. As the plane cruised onward, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Steady but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been informed of a sensitive issue involving members of our in-flight crew. Those involved will be relieved of their duties upon landing. We assure you that your safety and comfort remain our top priority. Gas rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged surprised glances. Grace Lee looked up from her book, eyebrows raised in quiet approval. David Sinclair shifted uncomfortably, his expression unreadable. Simone felt a flicker of hope. This was the beginning of accountability. The silent witnesses around her leaned in, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding. She was no longer alone in this fight. Lila looked up at her mother. Mom, what does that mean? Simone smiled gently. It means change is coming. As the flight continued toward Seattle, a new resolve took root within Simone, a promise that this exposure would not be the end, but the start of something greater. The hum of the aircraft's engines was a steady presence as Aurora Flight 2387 cruised steadily over the vast expanse between Chicago and Seattle. Simone Hayes sat quietly in her seat, her fingers gently brushing over the worn edges of her daughter Lila's sketchbook. The lines drawn across the pages told a story beyond mere images. They reflected the unspoken emotions and quiet resilience that had carried them through this journey. Suddenly, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. Maya Bennett, the junior flight attendant, approached Simone discreetly. Dr. Hayes, we have a secure call from Aurora Air's executive office. They requested you take it privately. The captain is facilitating the connection. Simone nodded and stood, steadying herself before following Maya toward the cockpit area. The narrow corridor felt charged with anticipation as she prepared for whatever awaited. In a small side cabin adjacent to the cockpit, Simone was handed a headset. The door closed behind her, sealing off the world behind. The line connected with a crisp beep, and a voice came through, calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. Dr. Hayes, this is Daniel Harper, Chief Operating Officer at Aurora Air Holdings. The man began. First, I want to sincerely apologize for the treatment you and your daughter have endured on this flight and prior to boarding. What you have experienced is unacceptable and directly violates our company's values and policies. Simone listened intently, the weight of the apology heavy but insufficient to erase the sting of the past hours. We have reviewed the internal communications among the crew, Daniel continued. The content is inexcusable. 3 employees have been immediately suspended pending further investigation, with formal termination expected after landing. Simone spoke for the first time, her voice measured but firm. Suspension is not enough. If this had happened to a less visible passenger, would you have even been aware? Mid-flight a pause filled the line before Daniel replied softly, Probably not. And that is part of the problem we are striving to fix. We ask you to allow us the opportunity to make this right publicly, transparently, and promptly. Simone took a breath, weighing her response carefully. I have no intention of letting this go quietly. Another voice joined the call, a woman's, calm and authoritative. Dr. Hayes, this is Elaine Montgomery, Head of Legal Affairs. We are preparing a full report for the FAA and internal review. Your legal team will have access to all communications and documentation without redactions or delay. Simone nodded, her resolve firm, Good. Because I intend to hold Aurora Air accountable. Elaine's tone softened slightly. Before you take further action, would you be willing to meet with the board after landing? We want to learn from this and implement real change. Simone's voice was calm but direct. That depends. Will the employees who insulted my daughter be there to listen? Elaine answered clearly. They will no longer be employees when you land. Simone allowed a small, resolute smile. Then I will consider the meeting. She removed the headset and turned toward the door. Maya was waiting, her expression hopeful. Back in her seat, Lila's wide eyes searched her mother's face. Did they say sorry? Simone reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. They did. But this isn't over yet. The weight of the moment settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, the realization dawning that what they had witnessed was more than an isolated incident. Marcus Fields, seated a few rows back, quietly hit the send button on his phone. The video that began at the gate and ended with the captain's announcement was now live. It would spread quickly. Simone did not watch the numbers rise. Her focus was on Lila, whose fingers returned to the sketchbook with renewed determination. This isn't about revenge, Simone whispered to her daughter. It's about making sure they can never do this again. Outside the window, the plane glided over a patchwork of fields and rivers, moving steadily toward the Pacific Northwest. Within the cabin, a quiet revolution was underway. The plane began its gradual descent toward Seattle, the city lights flickering faintly below like scattered stars awaiting the dawn. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and reflection. Simone Hayes sat upright in her seat, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, eyes fixed ahead, but thoughts far away. Lila sat beside her, sketchbook open but still, her pencil resting between her fingers. The steady hum of the engines seemed to lull some of the tension, but beneath it remained a current of change, silent, powerful, undeniable. Across the aisle, David Sinclair shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His tie was loosened, his posture less rigid than earlier. He glanced over at Simone, a new respect evident in his eyes. What had transpired on this flight was unlike anything he had witnessed before, a challenge to assumptions long held without question. Grace Lee closed her book quietly, her gaze gentle but sharp as she observed the cabin's subtle shifts. Maya Bennett sat nearby, her demeanor calm but charged with the unspoken knowledge that the events of the flight were shaping something greater than themselves. Simone's mind wandered through the hours behind them, the gate confrontation, the repeated questioning, the exposure of a deeper systemic prejudice disguised as protocol. She thought about the countless times she had been reduced to assumptions, the invisible barriers that attempted to confine her and others like her. Yet, here she was, still seated in first class, still dignified, still refusing to be diminished. Lila reached for her mother's hand, her eyes lifting with a mixture of fatigue and newfound strength. Mom, I think I understand now. Simone smiled softly, squeezing her daughter's hand gently. Sometimes understanding comes slowly, but it is always worth waiting for. The passengers around them were quiet, many lost in thought. The cabin was no longer just a place of travel. It had become a space of reckoning and reflection. The flight attendants moved more cautiously now, their earlier arrogance replaced by a subdued professionalism. Jennifer Ross offered Simone a brief nod as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle and the grace displayed. Simone's thoughts turned to the future, beyond this flight, beyond the immediate aftermath. Change was slow and often painful, but it was inevitable when faced with truth. David Sinclair finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "Dr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. I assumed things without knowing. That was wrong." Simone regarded him thoughtfully. "It was not about me, David. It was about the assumptions you made before knowing me." He nodded, the weight of his realization settling over him. Grace Lee added softly, "Sometimes change begins with discomfort. If you feel uneasy, it means you are learning." Simone looked at her daughter, pride mingling with hope. Eyes forward. "Lila, that is where we are going." As the plane touched down smoothly, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the cabin. The seatbelt signs illuminated, signaling the end of the journey, but not the end of the story. Simone and Lila prepared to disembark, stepping forward with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any words. Outside, the city lights of Seattle awaited, a new chapter ready to be written. The plane touched down gently at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The wheels kissed the runway, and the steady thrum of the engines began to slow as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted from tense to contemplative, as if the journey had left an indelible mark on everyone aboard. Simone Hayes sat poised in her seat, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Passengers who had once exchanged wary glances now offered quiet nods of acknowledgement. The subtle hum of conversation was filled with new respect, an unspoken understanding that they had witnessed something significant. Lila sat beside her mother, her sketchbook closed now, resting gently on her lap. The girl's fingers were entwined with Simone's, a silent bond of strength and love. Captain Mateo Rui's voice came over the intercom with a tone both professional and sincere. "Ladies and gentlemen, we want to inform you that following a thorough review, certain members of our in-flight crew have been relieved of their duties for the duration of this flight and will undergo further investigation. Your safety and comfort remain our highest priority, and we thank you for your understanding." Gasps echoed softly throughout the cabin. Grace Lee looked up from her seat, her expression calm but firm. David Sinclair shifted in his chair, eyes reflecting the gravity of the announcement. Simone met Lila's gaze and smiled gently. "It's a start," she whispered. As the plane came to a halt, passengers began gathering their belongings. Unlike the usual rush, the movement was measured, respectful. People who had once looked away now held their heads a little higher, their silence no longer complicit but reflective. Outside the aircraft, airline representatives waited by the jet bridge. Their faces were a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, knowing that the fallout from this flight would be significant. Simone rose from her seat, her posture impeccable. Lila stood beside her, a quiet strength radiating from the young girl. David Sinclair stepped aside, allowing Simone and Lila to pass first. His eyes met hers for a moment, conveying respect without words. The terminal buzzed with activity, but as Simone and Lila walked through the jet bridge, the world around them seemed to slow. Phones emerged, cameras clicked, whispers spread. The viral video circulating online had already begun to capture attention far beyond the confines of the aircraft. One of the airline officials stepped forward as they reached the end of the bridge. His smile was cautious. "Dr. Hayes, welcome to Seattle. We would like to discuss the situation at a convenient time." Simone raised a hand politely but firmly. "Not here. My team will coordinate with yours." She did not need to raise her voice or linger on explanations. The quiet confidence she carried spoke volumes. As they entered the terminal, the weight of the moment settled over the crowd. Simone could feel the eyes of strangers, the unspoken judgments and newfound respect mingling in the air. Lila held tightly to her mother's hand, her steps steady and sure. Outside, a black sedan waited silently, its driver opening the door with practiced efficiency. Simone and Lila stepped inside, the vehicle pulling away smoothly from the airport. Simone took one last look over her shoulder toward the terminal, the place where the battle had been fought and won quietly but decisively. Her voice was steady as she said to her daughter, "We walked on with our heads held high. No one can take that from us." Lila nodded, her smile faint but genuine. The city lights of Seattle stretched before them, a new horizon for a new chapter. The black sedan slid through the quiet streets of Seattle, carrying Simone Hayes and her daughter Lila away from the airport and the storm that had just passed. Inside the car, the soft hum of the engine was a soothing backdrop to the swirling thoughts that filled Simone's mind. The fight was over for now, but the battle was far from done. Lila sat beside her mother, her sketchbook once again resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the worn pages as she looked out the window, eyes wide and thoughtful. The city lights flickered past, a tapestry of possibility and hope. Simone glanced at her daughter, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. "You were brave today," she said softly. Lila smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "I was scared," she admitted, "but you showed me how to be strong." Simone reached over and took her daughter's hand. Strength isn't about not feeling fear. It's about moving forward despite it. The car moved steadily through the night, carrying them toward home and the challenges ahead. Simone's phone buzzed quietly on the seat beside her. She glanced down to see messages from her legal team and trusted advisors. The wheels were already turning behind the scenes. She had made it clear this would not be a quiet settlement. The systemic injustice she and Lila had faced demanded public accountability and real change. Outside, the cityscape shifted from glowing towers to the calm neighborhoods where families were tucked in for the night. Simone thought of the countless others who faced prejudice every day without the platform or power she wielded. The weight of responsibility pressed gently but firmly on her shoulders. At home, the soft click of the door closing marked the start of a new chapter. Simone and Lila settled into the quiet comfort of familiar surroundings. The sketchbook was opened once more, this time filled with new drawings lines of resilience, hope, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Simone sat at her desk, drafting a statement that would soon be shared with the media and the public. Her words were measured but powerful, a call for justice, transparency, and accountability. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready, not just for herself, but for Lila and for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than worthy. Later that evening, Lila sat beside her mother, whispering questions about what had happened and what was to come. Simone answered with honesty and care, planting seeds of hope and courage. "Remember," she said, "we don't have to raise our voices to be heard. Sometimes the quietest strength is the most powerful." Outside, the night sky was vast and full of stars. Inside, a mother and daughter found peace in their shared resilience and the unbreakable bond that would carry them through whatever came next. Dr. Simone Hayes and her daughter Lila didn't just keep their seats on that flight, they held their ground against injustice and prejudice. Their story reminds us that discrimination still thrives in places where we least expect it, even miles above the clouds. But it also shows us the power of dignity, quiet courage, and the strength it takes to demand respect without shouting. We must never accept silence in the face of injustice, or pretend that prejudice is anything less than a barrier that steals from us all. This story is a call to stand with those who are too often judged by the color of their skin or the assumptions others make. Thank you for witnessing this journey with us. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so more voices like Simone's can be heard. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and build a world where respect and equality are not the exception, but the norm. Stay with us for the next videos, more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power in standing strong. Until then, hold your head high and keep the fight alive.